You don't just buy a ticket, you play it.
You know, television can sometimes be great. Sometimes it can be yuck.
If you value the time you spend watching television, you'll appreciate the value of TV Guide magazine.
It's changed. Actually, I should say it's better because it just has a lot of new things it never had before.
For instance, in TV Guide, there are literally 8 pages of movies listed for you week after week after week. Now, where are you going to get that kind of coverage?
Great stuff. Give me the TV Guide every time.
BCTV, our best show.
Good morning. Far be it from me to fuel provincial election speculation. And by what Premier Bennett said last night at his $600,000 fundraising caper, he's still blaming the media for the speculation, and he doesn't know when the election is going to be, and he doesn't know why it's going to be. The media is not to blame for the campaign fund drives, the whistle stops, the election preparation, the government election ads, thinly disguised with the taxpayers' money of British Columbia putting them up front, the NDP panicking and spending their odd little nickel and dime for their cheap, quiet little ads. And all I want to do to you this morning is tell you what the scenario for an election must be. The last time, the very final chance he has to call an election before his mandate is up is the spring of next year. He can't call it then, because any government that goes its full 5 years in desperation is bound to be thrown out. He's left with 2 options: the fall of this year, September, October, or April, May. Now, you say he only has to call the House once a year, it doesn't matter when he calls it. That's correct, but at midnight on March the 31st, Mr. Bennett, who is very worried about his billion-dollar deficit, probably finish up about $426 million or $362 million. But when he runs out of money on April the 31st, March the 31st, he must do something. The normal way to do it is to call the House into session and present a budget. If he doesn't call the House into session and present a budget, he must get the money, about $20 million a day, to run the province. And he can only get that by what they call special warrants by order in council. These warrants are not blank checks to be given out by the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the order in council route. These are for matters of emergency. And before March the 31st, Mr. Bennett must decide. 1, is he going to call the House, go through a 2 or 3 week speech from the throne, interim supply, and drop the writ? Or is he going to continue through to the fall on special warrants? He cannot do that. It is constitutionally undesirable and not very nice. So his option is to continue without a session with special warrants to pay the civil servants' salaries, etc., and then drop the writ some short time thereafter, the first part of April, or call the House, speech from the throne, and then drop the writ. He cannot govern all through this summer by special warrants when his estimates for 1983 end on the 31st of March. So whether Premier Bennett likes it or lumps it, he's got to, I was going to say something very about, he's got to make up his mind one way or the other. He's got to ask the boys in blue, please give me a favorable poll and then I'll go for broke. But he's quite capable of sitting on this shaky fence without the proper finances to run the government until September. And if he does that, he will be beaten for sure. So I hope he drops the writ and brings in interim supply and goes for a short 28-day election campaign. I know there's a fair amount of panic in the finance department just now. You know, all the top officials met here yesterday and they're going to meet again on Friday. And this running the country by special warrant has not happened since 1953. And as my memory serves me, I'm sure I'm right in saying that was when Old Man Bennett won very narrowly, and 6 months later he called an election to be given a chance, which was the start of what was then a social credit steamroller under W.H.C. Bennett. So Billy Bennett has got to decide by the end of this month what his plan is. And I say if he runs the country by warrant till September, he'll be beaten for sure. Bit complicated, but we're not fueling the election speculation. And all this delay about it is bad for business, bad for confidence, bad for jobs, bad for planning, and bad for British Columbia. Let's have a decision, Mr. Bennett, before we all grow weary and migrate to Newfoundland or some less desirable place. Now, got to get down to today's business. I've got a cue here. The Tory herd of potential leadership candidates is still thundering through the West. Joe Clark, he'll be here shortly. He's one of them. Brian Mulroney, the man with the lantern jaw. Michael Wilson from Toronto, absolutely desirable for them. Joe Clark, oh, we've had him before. Peter Pocklington, 20% income tax. The tiny, perfect former mayor of Toronto. Brampton Billy Davis, still sitting in the weeds. Peter Lougheed, locked into the closet, won't come out. I don't know who that is. It's some Tory candidate for the leadership. Crosby, you know, the man with a sense of humor. And Peter Blaikie. Good old Peter. Another real live phony candidate for the leadership, knowing well that it's got to be Clark, Mulroney. Who's the other one?
Blaikie.
What a dreamer. Now, on the serious side this morning, I have an expert in occupational health, Dr. Jeanne Stellman, who is the executive director of the Women's Occupational Health Center at Columbia University. We'll find out what the latest hazards are in the marketplace of industry and offices. But first, Blaikie, after the break. Let me be perfectly clear, Peter Blaikie. I can't for the life of me understand why we've got all this horde of candidates when you know, and I know, and everybody else knows, that the likes of you does not have a single solitary chance of being anywhere near the final ballot.
I think I've got a chance, Jack, and I must say after the introduction I'm a little worried about you because it seems to me you're starting to take politics seriously. I mean, here you are, you've got a vest on, you're campaigning for a Senate seat. You're going to have to get it before the Liberals get out and before I take over.
Don't forget, I also had dinner with the Queen.
Aha.
So you see, that's why I'm wearing a vest this morning. But deadly seriously, you remember the last shambles when Clark was initially elected leader. And is it not a fact, Peter Blaikie, that Joe Clark became leader because of the regional hatreds and personality hatreds within the Tory party, whereby people like Sink Stevens and the other falling out candidates voted for the candidate they hated least? Is that not why Joe Clark became leader?
I don't think that's entirely fair. I think Joe became leader because, first of all, he ran a good, solid campaign.
And he was the candidate of compromise, wasn't he?
There was an element of that, but he was pretty strong on the issues. He performed well at the convention. Other people didn't perform as well as people thought they might.
I'm told
he did a good job.
I'm told that you're merely a ringer for Clark and going to build up your power base as a former national president of the party from Montreal, that you're merely a ringer for Clark as an additional support on the second ballot.
I was hoping you were going to say a stalking horse, Jack, because there we had the thundering herd, and I figured we were going to mix the metaphors. I'm not a ringer for anybody. When I ran for the presidency, people said, he's either a stalking horse for Clark or he's in there to front for Mulroney. I was my own man then, and I am now.
Why do you want to, and I've tried this with the very evasive, smooth, couth, sophisticated, ebullient Mr. Mulroney. Why do you want to stab Joe Clark in the back when he had 2/3 of the delegates? Why, what's wrong with Joe? Nobody will tell me why they want to dump Joe.
There's nothing wrong with Joe. I spent 2 years as president of the party working very hard with Joe. I campaigned twice in 1979 and 80 with Joe as leader of the party. If he wins again, I'll support him again. The question is...
Are you not merely muddying the waters now?
I don't think I am, no.
You've run twice for the House of Commons.
I have.
You have not yet succeeded.
I have not, although I think I have to say that in the context of what was going on in the country and in Quebec, I did well. And I actually did better in 1980 than I did in 1979.
So here you're another neophyte politician in the sense that you have not served your apprenticeship in the House of Commons.
I have not. But again,
and you want to go
would
straight in as Prime Minister?
No, I would like to go by way of the House of Commons. But I would like to go to the leadership of the party, then to the House of Commons, then, yes.
Well, unless the Liberals bring John Turner out of the closet, you're bound, the leader of the party is bound to be Prime Minister. What happens if Trudeau fools you by quitting next February, having a short leadership convention, and in whistles Turner?
That would be great. I think it would be great to run a campaign against John Turner.
Why?
First of all, I think we can beat him, but he's a worthy adversary. He's a good man, and I think once he gets out of the closet, as you say, the same thing will happen as happened to Teddy Kennedy in 1980. Ted Kennedy led Jimmy Carter by 20% in the polls till he became a candidate. Then the warts began to show, and he began to drop. John Turner, when he was Minister of Finance, he started the high inflation. He started the huge government spending. He started the tremendous increase in the civil service.
And
there are a lot of baggage there.
He crept away quietly and didn't do anything except to run his little newsletter, kind of jabbing at his old colleagues.
That's right.
Didn't have the guts to come out in public, did he?
That's correct. And when he left, he said he was leaving with no policy differences with the government. And in fact, there were very fundamental differences. So John Turner doesn't make me go weak in the knees.
Yeah, I know, but Joe Clark obviously does, or you wouldn't be running for the leadership.
Joe Clark doesn't make me go weak in the knees either. Only Jack Webster does that.
Do you want to get Joe Clark out because he blew it on budget night, he and Crosby and Baker and company, when you were defeated after 9 gloriously short months because you couldn't count heads?
But I don't think it's a question of wanting to get Joe Clark out. I supported Joe Clark. He called the convention himself, Jack. It was his decision.
Oh.
He didn't have to make that decision.
The pressure was heavy.
He didn't have to make that decision. He made the decision right after the vote on Friday night.
Was there not a backroom deal? If he didn't get, what was it, 70%? 67%. Had he not promised to step down if he didn't get 67%?
I don't know the answer to that. If that was an undertaking, it was made to the caucus at a meeting that I was not present at. I was generally at caucus. I was not at that meeting. I don't know whether there was an undertaking or not.
Okay, let me be fair now to Peter Blaikie. Married or single?
I'm married. My wife's a practicing psychiatrist. I have 4 children, 3 girls and a boy.
Send her around to give me a treatment one day, will you? We'll
do it together.
What do you do for a living when you're not campaigning for the Tory leadership?
Well, there was a time when I practiced law in Montreal. I was one of the founding partners of what's become a very successful Montreal law firm. And for the last 2 years, my partners have supported me while I've been president of the party.
Yeah, well, of course, Donald MacDonald's getting what, $400 a day to have
800. 800.
400 for himself, 400 for his law office. Isn't that right?
I'm not sure.
I'm
not sure.
Wouldn't empty the ashtrays in McDonald's.
It wouldn't cover your petty cash, Jack.
Some truth in that. Okay, a lawyer, married. Are you bilingual?
Yes, I am.
Are you fluently bilingual?
Yes, I am.
Is it compulsory to be bilingual to be a success in politics in this country?
It's not compulsory, but I think for the sake of the country it helps, yes.
Do you have any policies which are any different from the somewhat evasive policies of most of the candidates I've already interviewed? In other words, have you made up your mind on anything, Peter?
Well, you'll have to ask me questions on some specific issues, and I'll try to answer them.
Let me put it to you. You give me some specific issues on which you are firm.
All right, I'll give you a few. I think we need to make some specific changes in the Foreign Investment Review Agency. I can give you 2 or 3 possibilities. Number one.
Let's let the Yankees back in again with full freedom.
Number one, let's get that agency not just working as a shield trying to protect us. Let's get it out there looking for investment in areas where we need it. This country doesn't have a big enough pool of capital to finance huge deficits and finance investment.
We need the foreign investment.
There's no question about it. We need foreign investment.
We were better off when the Americans, the Dutch, and the British owned 99% of our oil industry.
No, I don't think that's the case. But if we want to take over the oil industry and make it Canadian, let's not disguise it by nationalizing it. Let's create, for example, a Canadian oil industry stock ownership plan. Let's make it attractive for Canadians to invest in that industry.
Isn't that what Lalonde's doing now, the Canadian ownership charge? He's got a Canadian ownership charge now.
Well, that was a means of paying for Petrofina. We paid roughly 3.2 cents a gallon for several years to buy Petrofina. It didn't create a job. It didn't create a new drop of oil in this country. It led to a huge exodus of capital, and the state owned it. That wasn't to anybody's benefit.
Would you break up Petrocan?
I would look very seriously, not immediately, but over the longer term, at the gas station operations, yes, because I think, frankly, what Petrofina has done has made the big oil companies laugh all the way to the bank. Petrofina doesn't operate as efficiently as they do, but they sell at the same price. But it's not a top priority item, because it would lead to an enormous political battle, a lot of energy wasted. But it's something we have to look at down the line.
Capital punishment, yes or no?
Well, that's a terrible way to put that question. I would, on a free vote, vote to reinstate it, but how can you decide such an awesome question by saying yes or no? I would vote to reinstate capital punishment for willful, premeditated murder.
Well, I've got to do these things with you people from the East, you know.
I see.
We are alienated. Let's not misunderstand me, my friend.
Well, we're going to bring you back in, Jack. We're going to change the hours of voting. We're going to reform the Senate. We're going to bring the West back in.
Not a bad idea to bring the West back in. I hate to mention this one. Yes or no? Abortion.
I'll never have one. I won't need one.
Well,
again, it's a massive question, Jack. There are a whole series of conflicting principles. If we applied this criminal code as it's written, that's probably the best answer we can get. I don't believe in what effectively is birth control by abortion. I don't believe in what's happening when people are having abortions virtually at term. On the other hand, I don't think we go back to where we were 30 years ago.
That's fair enough.
You can't answer that question yes or no.
You're right in that, because I happen to agree with my own position on it.
Good.
What else now? What else? Cruise missiles. Would you allow the Yankees to test the unarmed cruise missiles in our northern land because it more approximates Soviet territory?
The answer is yes, I would. I think it's part of the obligation that we have to NATO. I think it's part of the obligation we have to help in our own defense. So the answer to that is yes.
How dangerous this country is Trudeau?
I think he's been enormously dangerous for reasons that are not always the ones talked about. What he has basically done, I think, is sap the self-respect of the country. I think he's sapped the confidence of the country. Basically, what's gone wrong is that people just don't believe him anymore. There's no sense of confidence. His integrity is in question.
Bill MacArthur, the president of the Tory party here, brought you here this morning, didn't he? Is
yes,
he the one delegate you have?
He's one among hundreds, Jack, one among hundreds. He's one of the biggest ones and one of the most prominent ones.
Certainly one of the largest ones.
He's one of the largest ones.
Okay. How much money will you spend in this campaign?
I suspect, Jack, I'll spend less than you earn in a year, but I will have the most modest campaign of all.
You can't run this campaign on less than 6 figures cash multiplied by 2.
That's about right. That's about what I'll spend. 6 figures by 2 is $200,000. That's about right.
All donated by friends and supporters?
All donated by friends and supporters in relatively small amounts.
Any of your own money in it?
There'll be a bit, but not much. I don't have much, and I can't afford to go into debt.
You will understand, you will appreciate, I'm sure, my attitude this morning, because I just had the feeling that, you know, you're all running around with your heads cut off, and it's going to come down to one of the
terrible
three.
Man. You're
Crosby,
terrible,
Mulrooney,
terrible
or Clark.
How much are you prepared to put on that? $5? $5?
I was going to go on that. Okay, I'll give you $5. I'll give you 2 to 1.
All right.
$10 to $5. There's 3 finalists: Crosby, Mulrooney, and Clark.
I'll take you up on that.
Okay. Your questions to Peter Blaikie. Really a very nice guy. How old are you? I forgot to ask you.
I'm 45.
45. Getting on a bit. After the break. Peter Blaikie is a serious candidate for the leadership of the so far fractured Conservative Party. Go ahead to Peter.
Good morning, Jack. Good morning, Peter. I have two questions. First of all, one that has been, Mulroney has been very evasive on. If you were the head of the Conservative Party and as, hypothetically as Prime Minister, what would your position be with respect to the Alberta Premier Lougheed and the oil situation with our ongoing little problem with the 75% of the world market price? And my second question would be, what is your thoughts and feelings on the banking system in this country and what their huge profits have been as of late? Thank you.
Right, they're both kind of specious questions, but first on the oil prices, would you attempt to break down the Trudeau-Lougheed deal which hangs us with ever-increasing oil prices?
Well, Jack, can I answer his question, if I may?
Yeah.
I think in 1973 we made a terrible mistake in not adjusting to world oil prices. I think we tried to protect the country behind a wall. It doesn't work. We're in international markets. I think that we have to go to world prices for both oil and natural gas. As far as the banking system is concerned, there's no question that bank profits are big. I've never thought that was the most serious weakness in our banking system. I think the real weakness in the banking system is a lack of competition amongst the banks. I don't think the banks properly service the growth sector of our economy, which is small and medium-sized businesses. That's where we've got to do the real work in terms of the banking system. You do it by more banks, more financial institutions, and more competition.
And they sure demonstrated their general incompetency when they were caught with all their billions of dollars of outstanding loans as the world prices collapsed, weren't they?
There's no question. That's been part of the problem in the banking system. I don't think the question of profits is really the central flaw in the system.
I think they showed themselves up as really not very good businessmen.
Large extent, that's true.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, my thanks to the excellent interviewer, Jack Webster, for giving airtime to all the candidates.
God bless me.
It certainly helped make up my mind that mine will be a choice between, in chronological order, Joe Clark, Peter Puck, and Peter Blaikie, because I liked the issues and answers that they presented.
Good for Blaikie.
Glad to hear that. Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Webster.
Yes.
Mr. Blaikie there.
Yes, he's here.
I live in the West Coast. What are some of your issues that would really get me interested as you, like to be a leader?
Okay, give us a West Coast position on something.
Well, I think there are two or three things we have to do. First of all, and I think it's of interest across the country, I would want to see property rights entrenched in the Constitution. Secondly, I would like to see the Senate reformed in order to provide regional representation. I would like to see us working extremely hard to increase exports in the Pacific Rim. That means putting government to work arm in arm with the business community in order that we help sell in that part of the world, which we have not been doing now. I think we have got to continually work at improving our relations with the United States. That's important in BC because you are major exporters in your basic industries.
We were saved by the skin of our teeth on the first step in countervailing duties, weren't we?
Yes, on the lumber industry. Yes,
what did you make of all this double talk and hypocrisy that went on between the Aboriginal leaders and the First Minister's Conference?
Well, I don't accept that hypothesis. I think that conference was a very good exercise. I think one of the things it did was give an extraordinary amount of credibility to the representatives of the native peoples. I'm delighted that that process of negotiation is going to continue.
Of course, we live in British Columbia, you mustn't forget, where there are virtually no tribal treaties under the old Crown colonial bit, right? Niskus and a few others. The Indians, the Aboriginal natives in British Columbia would seem to want the whole country back. Somebody's going to have to tell them one day they ain't going to get it.
I think it's perfectly clear that they are not going to get the whole country back. But within that context, there obviously has to be something done, some agreement reached, which is going to make the native peoples independent and not, as I think is the case for too many today, dependent on the state. We have made too many people dependent on the state.
Yeah, they're serfs of an incompetent colonial-type administration under the Liberal and the Tory Indian Affairs Department.
Well, if you're going to apportion blame there, we don't take much of it. We haven't been there for very long.
Funny how you've only been in power a handful of minutes in the last 50 years.
We'll change that, Jack. We'll change that.
This time do you promise that if there is a leader you will not sacrifice him like Diefenbaker was sacrificed?
Well, since I propose to be the leader, I don't permit myself to be sacrificed.
Yeah, one of Joe's friends was telling me the other day that the knives in his back only hurt him when he laughs. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Yes.
I got an important question I'd like to ask.
Ask it.
Hello?
Ask it.
About property rights.
Yes.
In the new Constitution, it says that we have the right to assembly, we have the right to religion, we have certain rights, but there isn't nothing in there about property rights, i.e. you have the own right to the property you create, you through your mind's thought, da-da-da. And it says earlier on in the Constitution, anything that's not written, take it for granted that we have it. And then why is there we have the right to religion and assembly and stuff?
Okay, property rights. You already covered it.
Well, there's no question they have to be entrenched. The right to property is one of the fundamental human rights, and we've seen what happens when they're not entrenched in the national energy policy, when there was effectively confiscation at the rate of 25% of discoveries. It's one of the priorities for a conservative government.
But surely, especially being beside the United States, that some government must have control over the eventual disposition of land, like in PEI, like in the farmlands and the prairies. You cannot give a Canadian the right to sell his land in large quantities to whomsoever he wishes who is not Canadian.
Well, first of all,
we must retain title to the land.
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that, but that's not contradictory. When we talk about property rights, we're talking about something far more than just ownership of land. And the entrenchment of property rights is not ever going to be absolute. In other words, governments will always retain the right to expropriate with proper compensation.
Or to regulate the sale of land to whom, if there's a big drive by California, which is going to be swept into the sea, to buy our country.
I mean, that is not inconsistent with entrenching property rights.
Well, I always thought it was. But I could be wrong. I occasionally am. After the break. I was really quite gentle with you this morning. I asked Peter Pocklington recently when he had last left his body by astral projection and soared over the towers of the Kremlin.
You were tender, Jack.
And he attempted to deny it. Would you believe it?
Really?
Says he only believes partially in astral projection.
I see. Which part?
Every night I go up the ceiling and have a look at myself to see if I'm all right. Go ahead from Victoria, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. I have a question for your guest, Jack. How much of this attention focused on the leadership is more of a ruse, and all these gentlemen are lining up to get themselves a cabinet portfolio? Of course, there'll only be a shadow cabinet, so it won't much matter, but there's enough there to carry on a government.
Well, I'm only going to speak for myself, and I'm not lining up for a cabinet post. I'm in this race because I would like to be the leader of the party.
But you can't tell me now to whom you will throw your votes if you're about to be wiped off the bottom of the first ballot, can you?
I can't, and even if I could, I wouldn't, because at this point in the campaign, if you allow yourself to start thinking in that way, you're not going to have a chance of winning. You've got to focus on the objective. You've got to do everything with that objective in mind.
Go ahead, please. From Victoria.
One question. What will be your attitude toward the provincial Progressive Conservative Party in British Columbia if you become leader? Thank you.
Don't answer that. The phone may be bugged.
That is about the most delicate question one gets in this province. I have a broad principle, a very broad one, which is that obviously I would like to see a progressive conservative government in every province in Canada. But I recognize that in this province there is a very complex situation. One cannot behave like the thundering herd. I think the situation will be far clearer after the next provincial election, and it may be that some steps should be taken at that time. It would be most unwise of the federal party to intervene in any way in the current situation and in the election which is going to come depending on whether Bill Bennett listens to Jack Webster nearer or in the farther future.
Right, of course. That means, dear listener, that if you're a Tory, we want your votes federally, but provincially, please vote social credit.
Well, it means provincially vote as your conscience sees fit. Federally, we want your votes.
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Blaikie.
Yes.
Yes. What do you intend to do if you do get in as, let's say, Prime Minister, to get this country back on its feet, employment-wise?
The first thing I think I'm going to do is make clear that all Canadians understand that we are not going to get unemployment down dramatically in a short period of time. We are talking about probably 5 to 10 years before we really get unemployment down to acceptable levels. To do that, we have to do several things. Number one, we have to ensure that we stay competitive. That means moderating wage and salary demands across the country at all levels. Number two, we've got to stimulate investment. Initially, particularly in our traditional industries, because that's where our base remains today. Number three, we've got to be very generous in funding research and development so that 5 or 10 years from now, we are actively at the forefront of the high-tech industries. That's not going to happen in 6 months. It's going to take time, and it's going to take a massive national effort of political will and political courage. And everybody's going to have to participate in it.
We're going to have to unleash the private sector.
We are going to have to unleash the entrepreneurs and the risk takers in this country, yes.
You said it better than Mulroney did, so you get a gold star for your answer.
Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I'm a great believer, like Jack is, in the traditional way of appointing a prime minister. I think that should be done with the elected caucus of the government. If they don't like him, they can fire him and appoint another one without all the hooplas. Point two, as far as the Charter of Rights is concerned, the entrenchment should be dug into a big trench and bury the Charter of Rights and cover it over with a lot of dried up heifer's dust to go back to what we had before. We were far freer, better managed, and better laws makings by the Parliament of this country than by a so-called judicial system.
Hear, hear.
Now, 2 points here. One, we have some 200,000, so said, illegal aliens in the country, and the misuse of the of our immigration laws in regards to the scams that are being committed today, and including immigration itself. We have some 2 million to 3 million Canadians unemployed. Why don't we stop all of this nonsense? I'll hang up and listen.
As to the question of illegal aliens, I'm a believer that the laws should be respected, and that applies to every law, including the immigration law. As to immigration policy generally, it seems to me that this country has been built by immigrants. Most of us, or our forefathers, were immigrants to this country. I think the future of this country lies in an immigration policy which brings talent into the country. The country is so vast, it is relatively underpopulated. I'm not one of those who believes that we should close the doors, but our laws should be respected.
I recommend strongly, if you haven't already done so, that you read the Auditor General Dye's report on the widespread illegal scams and rackets operated without let or hindrance in the Employment and Immigration Department of Canada.
Well, that's
it's
outrageous.
There in black and white.
That's outrageous, and that's got to be corrected. Laws have to be respected.
Not at the moment they don't. However, that's
well, they may not be being respected, but they should be.
Talking about the Charter of Rights, I mean, I basically object to this copy in the Yankee written down Constitution, which really trammels us. We've got a great situation in BC just now, where the legal profession, good people, say we have to cut off all legal aid for 3 months between May and September because the government's too mean to give us the money. What's that effect? The Charter of Rights says that every Canadian is entitled to fundamental justice, a fair trial, ability to obtain counsel, etc., etc., etc. So we've got a Charter of Rights that says everybody must have a lawyer, but the Charter of Rights doesn't pay the legal bills. How do we get over that one?
I would think with great difficulty. It seems to me if you're going to bring in that kind of a system, you've got to be prepared to either fund it or change the system. If the system is there, you have to fund it.
We have a major crisis here. We don't have the money for it, we're told. They're leaning on the Treasury Board now in Victoria, but the Charter of Rights says, give them a lawyer.
Well, I don't think governments can behave that way. In fact, they either have to change the law and have the courage to say that or fund it.
Yeah. The old federal provincial caper all over again. Oh, it's in the law, but we're not going to pay. We agreed to the law, but we can't pay.
Well, that's part of the problem in the whole country. We haven't had the guts to talk about some of those hard issues. Where's the money going to come from to fund these things? And if we can't fund them, then we have to be prepared to change them.
From Yellowknife, go ahead, please.
Yes, hello, Jack.
Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Blaikie.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. I'm watching this on CanCom also, and I'm very interested on your views on the taxation of northern benefits. I realize that you might not be all that aware of what we're involved with up here, but there are not all that many incentives for us to stay up here regarding our costs that are incurred by us living up here. Just hang up and listen.
No, answer me this question. In the 1981 budget, which is still hanging around, McKechnie brought in, he took away your northern taxable benefits, did he not?
Yes, he did. There is a moratorium on it right now, but
it's quite crazy. By the way, how's the weather in Yellowknife this morning?
the weather in Yellowknife, it was about minus 28 this morning, but it is warming up.
Minus 28. How do we come through on CanCom?
You come in excellent.
Keep watching. It's the only thing that will keep you sane in Yellowknife.
That is true. That is true. Thank you very much, Jack.
Don't get bushed now. Remember that. We're also CanCom across the country, but we don't go into the major centres, unfortunately. We go into the cable systems, about 800 cable systems across the country.
So we have Webster across Canada, brightening up the day.
One day when I'm running the country, we'll take the media centre out of Toronto and Ottawa and their mafia.
Actually, why don't you
and
become
put it
a
where
candidate?
It belongs.
It's only fair that you should
There
be a candidate.
isn't a party I could run
once.
for. There isn't. My father would turn over in his grave if I ran for the Tories, and he would similarly turn over in his grave if I ran for the Liberals or the milk and water socialists of the NDP.
It's the Rhinoceros Party, Jack. You are the leader of the Rhinoceros Party.
Big enough, but not smart enough. My thanks to Peter Blaikie. Go your merry way, and don't forget our bet. $10 to $5.
That's right.
That the first three are Clark, Mulroney, and Crosby.
On the first ballot or at the end?
Don't put conditions on it now. At the end.
At the end, okay, at the end.
My thanks to Peter Blaikie. Next, Women's Occupational Health Centre and standards and problems with environment in the workplace, as we say so clumsily nowadays. After the break. Expenditure. Dr. Jeanne Stellman is Executive Director at Columbia University of the Women's Occupational Health Center. And every time I pick up a paper, Dr. Stellman, I'd see concerns about office workers and VDTs. Is that a bogey? Is that unnecessary panic? Or are there dangers to women working, men or women, working in video display terminal areas?
Well, I don't think it's a bogey. There are more than 10 million of these things in operation, and they're totally transforming the workplace. Some of the hazards that people are worried about are probably not real. Others are there that they should be worrying about, and they're just not paying any attention to.
But if I'm a woman working in a VDT, pregnant or no, can I be assured one way or the other if it's safe?
Well, let's not talk about being pregnant. Let's put that aside, because women are not, this is news, pregnant all the time. They're only pregnant a short part of their lives. Can you be assured it's safe? I think you can be fairly certain that you're not being irradiated. And if you are being irradiated, compared to where other workers are irradiated, it's a much, much lower level. Can you be sure about what it's doing to your eyes and your back and your sanity? No, you can't be sure about that at all.
Does not the same apply, for instance, to an inefficient microwave oven which leaks?
Well, who wants to compare it to that, you know? What's an inefficient microwave oven is probably very dangerous, and every microwave oven should have a meter that's sold with it. If I were running the Food and Drug Administration, I would insist that every oven be sold with a meter to tell whether it's leaking or not.
All right, now, we're talking about occupational health hazards, right?
Right.
What about television cameras and monitors and these kind of things?
They leak radiation, and they have to be monitored, and they have to be shielded so that the radiation is kept away. And I think there is inadequate precautions at most television stations, and I'm very concerned about the radio frequency that comes off. My husband and I are doing a new study on physical therapists, and we're finding in males adverse reproductive effects. We're finding hypertension, things like that, in the people who do physical therapy.
Just a minute. What do you mean physical therapy? How could that be effective?
Because the person who gives the physical therapy is using equipment that has radio frequency, has microwaves in it, and it leaks. We found levels of radiation from this equipment that exceeded all international standards to the patient, let alone the operator.
But there's sometimes got to be a balance of benefits. For instance, if you're being treated by cobalt for cancer, you obviously must, if you decide, accept that risk, mustn't you?
Yes, but must the person who's handling your urine and blood accept the risk that you are radiating? Is that a risk that she or he has to accept? Why aren't you covered with a lead blanket to protect those workers who don't wear badges to tell how much they're being exposed to?
Well, one would have thought that that was the kind of elementary precaution which had been attended to by this time in the 20th century.
One would have thought, wouldn't it? But in fact, most radiation, once you leave the x-ray room in the hospital, is totally unmonitored, and the only people who wear the badges are the doctors and the few people who are labeled x-ray technicians. But you treat a patient with cobalt, you treat him for uterus cancer, prostate cancer, that patient is emitting levels of radiation that are unmonitored, unknown, and if you're lying in the hospital bed next to him, he's irradiating right through that wall, and you're being irradiated, unprotected.
Is that proven to be enough to be a hazard?
National Commission of Radiation Protection from the United States has put out a booklet in which they cite the levels, and if you work around that patient for a year, you're exceeding your level. Of course, we don't know it because we very cleverly never monitor the people who do that job. And we certainly never monitor the person in the laundry who's using the sheet that these patients are lying on, not to mention the other infectious agents that are traveling around.
What do you do? It's almost an insuperable, insoluble problem.
Well, you make it a priority. For one thing, you start teaching doctors about it. I'm at Columbia Physicians and Surgeons, one of the 3 best medical schools in the country. We do not teach one course for 1 hour to any of our physicians about occupational medicine. Every physician in the United States and Canada learns more about tropical medicine, and as you know, tropical diseases are very widespread in these countries. They spend more time on that than they do about occupational disease. They understand nothing about it, and they can't diagnose it, and when things go unrecognized, they go unregulated.
And you say it's possible that people can be more reasonably protected in all these present-day hazards?
Oh, absolutely. We did a survey at a large hospital in New York, and this hospital obviously was progressive because they let us in, and we went through that hospital, and as we couldn't do a good study because every time we pointed out a hazard, they eliminated it. There's no reason for people with hepatitis to have their blood transferred all over the place and thrown into garbages and people to get hepatitis. Hepatitis is endemic among hospital workers. Hepatitis is a very serious disease. We think we're relating it to liver cancer in hospital workers.
You're now telling me you're not talking about radiation. You're talking about the diffusion of germs by sloppy handling.
See, doctors have a trick about germs in the hospital. They call it nosocomial infection, right? So that if you're lying in your bed with this staph infection and the doctors and the residents stand around their bed, they don't say, this man is suffering from a disease we gave him. They say, oh, looks like he's got a nosocomial infection, and now you think you have some exotic disease, but in fact what you got was a hospital-acquired disease. And the only nosocomial infections we count, I don't know if you count them at all up here, but in the United States, the only ones we count are on the patients. We never look at the infection rate in the workers, ever. We never count that.
You're fearsome. Some of your facts are quite fearsome. I can understand everybody's concerned about radiation from whatever. But you're telling me that our way of handling illness and disease is so sloppy that we don't even take the most elementary precautions.
It's always good to go to a hospital when you're feeling well, because if you go there when you're sick, you've got some bad news. We're doing a study. We have now completed a study on hospital workers in the United States of 160,000 organized hospital workers in a hospital union. We have cancer as their only leading cause of death. We have a 3-fold relative increase in leukemia and lymphoma. A particular reason that we did the study is because they use a gas called ethylene oxide to sterilize plastics. You know, stuff like this you can't put through an autoclave, heat it up because it'll melt, so you put it in a sterilizer. The chemical that's used, ethylene oxide, immediately latches onto every protein into your genes in your body. This has been known for years, and workers are exposed to levels in hospitals that are way above every standard. Some of them are exposed enough to get their noses bleeding. And this is the standard operating procedure in hospitals in order to sterilize things. About 10 years ago, we found that patients, when they used the sheets or whatever that came out of this, that they were developing skin rashes, so they installed aerators in the hospitals. But no one ever told them to install the aerator next to the sterilizer, so the workers take the stuff out, they walk in the stream of air, they put it in the aerator, and then they open the door to let it escape. Now, that's not the worst thing I've ever seen, and I have a personal campaign against this product, is they have something called a flash bag, which they use to sterilize. And if you have a handset, for example, that you want to sterilize real quick from someone's mouth, you throw it in this flash bag, you seal it up, you break an ampule of ethylene oxide, you let it sterilize, and then you open it up. And you breathe it in through the great filtration system, and it goes right into your blood, and God knows what it does. Well, we do know what it does. It causes cancer, it causes reproductive hazards, but of course we only know this in animals, so we can keep on exposing workers until we prove for a fact that if it does it in rats and mice and rabbits and guinea pigs, it's also going to do it to people, you see.
Who's going to clean it up?
Who's going to clean it up? That's a good question. I think workers are afraid, you know, increasing unemployment. If they have to choose between being exposed and not having a job, they'll choose being exposed. I think the one way that we can really get workers activated is when we prove that they're affecting their children, because after all, what are you working for except your children?
More with Dr. Jeanne Stellman, Executive Director of the Occupational Health Center at Columbia University, after the break. Dr. Stellman is a bit frightening when she gives you some of the hazards around, especially in hospitals. But surely, Dr. Stellman, looking at it from a common sense point of view, the benefits of today's society, by and large, far outweigh the handicaps we had of yesteryear, when the death rate at birth was horrendous, the expectation of life was, well, 10, 15 years shorter only 50 years ago.
Well, let me talk about that. I think there's no question at all that child nutrition, preventive medicine, public health for children has vastly changed the way of life. One reason we don't have a lot of children is we can count on them. The children that we have will live. But the life expectancy for a 35-year-old man today is only a couple of years longer than it was at the turn of the century. You see, the statistics lie because in those statistics are buried all the changes in childhood mortality. Once you eliminate the children, when you talk about a middle-aged person today, well, I don't like to talk about 35 as middle-aged anymore, but when you talk about a 35-year-old person today, the life expectancy has not changed. It has not changed.
Wouldn't it be about 72?
72, and not only
a woman 78?
Yes, but if you let, I don't have it right at my fingertips, right. But a 35-year-old person in 1930 had that same expectancy. I mean, if we're talking about 2 or 3 years, look what we're giving away for the quality of life.
The chances of being alive at 35, 50 years ago were a hell of a lot less.
Once you made it past the child.
Once you made it past the first 5 years.
That's right. But once you got to middle age, once you became a functioning adult, it really hasn't changed that much.
Okay, we've covered the hospitals. And if I get the pictures, one, there are great radiation hazards. There are bad handling hazards of things like
blood, urine. Right.
That's almost terrifying.
Yes.
There's a bit of a panic on just now about blood transfusions too, as far as AID is concerned.
And no one has asked the question, have they, about all the people who handle these bloods? I mean, there are people who take it out of your blood, put it into bottles, test it, transmit it, give it to you again. When was the first concern you heard raised about all those people who do that for a living?
Came out of San Francisco, the first concern, as far as I call. I think we have a better blood donor system than you have.
Your whole healthcare system is so superior to
ours.
Well,
it's socialized.
That's right.
Why are you so backwards?
Not me.
It is
not
you.
Me. Not me.
You're part of that culture.
No, I'm an immigrant.
Why don't you have a decent left-wing?
My family's Canadian.
Why don't you have a decent left-wing party in the United States?
That's a very good question. I find, when I look at what you consider right-wingers here, to me, your right-wingers are our left-wingers.
Listen, that guy Blaikie who was here this morning is a raving communist by your standards.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's sitting in a country with socialized medicine and isn't trying to take it apart.
Wouldn't dare touch it.
That's right.
And
I agree.
All the rest of it.
I agree.
You are so backward, you Americans.
I agree.
It really is a shame. Now, we talked about the hospitals. What about offices? What about the new, terrifying work processing factory of today?
Well, I think that's exactly what I would call it. I would call the introduction of automation into the office the turning of the offices into factories. That factories and assembly lines that are worse in many respects than the assembly lines of Detroit when they used to operate. Of course, we've managed to eliminate those hazards pretty well by just taking them away. We're talking about people who sit 7 hours in a day in a chair, entering data, which they have no idea what it's about, where their keystrokes per minute are timed by a machine, where they're supervised, where their error rate is timed. And in this province, in some places where women work, they will enter their data, they will have their keystrokes timed, they will have their error rate timed, and even if they correct themselves within their own quota, they still get penalized for their errors. They aren't allowed to make a mistake and correct themselves.
I want you to give me that again more slowly.
Okay.
Okay, I'm a woman working in an automated wood factory.
Right,
of
you're
some
entering
kind.
some medical data or
Medical
something.
data, okay.
Insurance data. And you're entered in, and there's a machine. The machine keeps time with how many keystrokes, how many times your finger
That's the one I
touches.
get. As I'm striking the keys, a machine
every
is
single
taking
one.
my rate of key strike.
Right, and usually you do it twice, you see, so that when you do it twice, the machine tells you if you've made a mistake, if the number you typed in the second time isn't the same as the first time. That's called verifying, and that's an error, eh? And if you correct that error, that rate of errors is kept track of, and if you correct that error and you still meet your quota, they still count that against you. Some places they call you in once a month and they give you a productivity report. Now, if we talk about assembly lines of automobiles, you can't compare that. That is closer timing and closer supervision than on the assembly lines of automobiles. And not only that, you can't talk to anybody. At least you could joke with the guy who's welding next to you. Here, you're just isolated with this machine. It's you and the box. And the worst thing is, see, this is going to start happening at home. What's going to happen is people aren't even going to be able to sit next to one another. Soon they're going to be working at home in cottage industries. We're going to have a return of the cottage industry because all you need is a cable and a machine. And you can have your little kitties around you while you're typing away. That's what's coming next.
How about a dose of anarchy?
I agree with that, too.
How about smashing the machine? What were
Well, the saboteurs. With saboteurs, they threw their sabots and their wooden shoes into the things. I think we should have VDT tours, you know. Just throw them in.
Toll pedal martyrs.
Right.
Were they the boys that, no, they were the unions. Who were the guys that broke up the spinning wheels?
That was the
Arkwright.
Right. Oh, in England.
In England.
Right, I can't. The Luddites.
Luddites, that's it.
Right.
How many hours a day do they sit and have their
7
keystrokes?
hours a day. We found that 50% of them sit in chairs where they can't even change the back to support their back. It's a major breakthrough. A major industrial breakthrough is the right to take a break every 2 hours. You know, it's kind of inhuman.
Anything else that depressed me about?
Let's see. They don't make a lot of money when they do it.
Good unions, of course, can correct all these things.
Well, women aren't organized, you know. I am a child of trade unionists, and I am a trade union-oriented person, but I must say that unions have not done enough to organize women.
So now we're no longer worried about the women who used to toil in the watch factories getting doses of radium as they painted them on watch faces.
Right.
That's
well,
gone.
No, we have to worry about those too. You see, those are the jobs that are still going to women. The major loss of jobs in our...
Don't blame me for that.
Well, you blame me for America. Why shouldn't I blame you for radium?
Because you're an
watch
American, I'm not a woman.
Yes, but you own the factory. It was the men.
So they say. You're quite a breath of... No, you're not a breath of fresh air. You're a breath of very depressing air. But you're good, Jeannie. Wee Jeannie. You're from Canada originally?
No, I was born in Germany in a displaced persons camp.
And came out to Canada first? No.
No, we came to the United States. My family wasn't allowed in, though. The rest of them, they had to come to Canada. I don't think that was such a compromise, but
no,
America didn't see fit to take us all.
Calls to Jeanne Stellman, an occupational health hazard for women?
All people.
All people. Men are people too, after the break. Before I go to the phones, I've got to ask you about, are you interested in the pesticide problem? Is that an occupational health hazard broadly?
Oh, of course it's an occupational health hazard. We as a society think that we can use chemicals that kill off every other living creature and that somehow we as human beings are immune from that which kills everything else. They're biocides, they have biological effects. We're very concerned in the United States about Agent Orange, and my husband...
About which?
Agent Orange, you know, the stuff...
Oh, the stuff you Americans
and
used on the Vietnamese.
And which you let us test on you first, which I thought was very gracious of our northern neighbors.
We did that up in Manitoba.
No, out in the east, in Newfoundland, wasn't it?
Doesn't matter.
Someplace out there. Yes, and yes, here, because just like we're going to do the cruise missiles, I guess. I think
well, you wouldn't expect us to cop out on our commitments to our American allies, would you?
That's right. It's the only reason.
You've got to take the lead. You're the big boys. You've got to get a protest.
It saves you a lot of money by having us pay for the defense.
It certainly does.
That's right.
I mean, that's exactly what happened.
Good planning.
Pesticides.
Pesticides. exposing people to pesticides is expecting them to be affected by that.
I'm talking about workers.
Workers. Do you know what farm workers do? Farm workers, especially the migrant workers, don't have a place to put their kids. In California, they sit their children under the big broad grape leaves, and then the grape leaves drip the pesticides on the kids. We know that pesticides can induce sterility, can induce birth defects, can induce cancer, can induce blood abnormalities, and yet we leave our farm workers unregulated and unprotected. And you know, in the United States, they're exempt from every labor law. I don't know how it is up here.
Bit of a fight going on here just now. They've just
that.
been exempted from the Compensation Board regulations.
Well, I think all the fruits and vegetables that we eat have a lot of sin attached to them.
Do you eat these fruits and vegetables?
Yes, by the time it gets to us, you know, the environmentalists are always taking care of us, the public, and by the time it gets to us, almost everything is off. It decomposes. It's while it's in the fields that it's of great concern. You know, if we use the pesticides to kill the whales, everybody would be up in arms about it. But when it's only doing in the workers, I don't see too many protests.
Well, it does in everybody, I suppose, in the final analysis.
Probably.
But mind you, if it hadn't been for DDT, the vast areas of the underprivileged in the world would be dead of malaria.
Look, I was showered by DDT when I was a baby, and it kept great epidemics from coming into Germany. But DDT was a stupid issue. DDT, compared to the other chemicals that we use, is probably far less toxic to people. It's bad for the environment, and it really shows the priority that we have. We're saving the eagles, and I'm not opposed to eagles. I think eagles are nice, but we took away the DDT, and now we're using far more toxic things, far more toxic to people, and to the ecology, most certainly, instead of DDT. It's crazy.
I don't see any hope.
Well,
you're nothing but the bearer of the worst possible tidings.
I hope I don't get my head chopped off.
Go ahead, please.
Hey, two questions. One, on the video display terminals, aren't regulatory bodies such as the Canadian Standards Association and OSHA or UL in the United States regulating the manufacturing to the degree where the radiation levels are kept low? And if not, why not?
Well, I don't think that radiation is actually the major problem of VDTs. There is no standard. What they're using is the television standard of a radiation of 0.5 millirads per hour, which is probably good enough for ionizing radiation. The problem is we're at the great unknown. We don't know. VDTs give off very high levels of something called extremely low frequency radiation, which is similar to house current, but much higher levels, and there is not one good scientific study on this sort of radiation. We are really treading around in the area where we haven't done the work, and I don't think it's any accident, because radio frequency and microwave is the heart of the telecommunications and the military industry, and that's why we don't want to know the answer, and we don't have the answer.
Is it true that the Russian standards are approximately half of what the North American standards
are? Well, you know,
the
Russians take whatever we do and cut it way down, and their standards on everything are much more stringent. The question is whether they obey their own standards, and I have no idea about that. But their standards are much, much lower, but it's not really based on firm data. If it was based on firm data, I'd say, great, let's use their data, but they haven't published very much.
Okay, go ahead, please.
No wonder the Russians want to kill us.
No wonder who wants to kill us?
The Russians.
Yeah.
Well, because they're all operating on half standards, and we're not.
You didn't hear.
I was glad to hear your guest say that 35 is middle age. That's very nice for anybody who's around 35. And the next thing I'd like to know is, Jack, what are your chances of having children, seeing as you're around so many pieces of TV equipment?
I have 4 children, 8 grandchildren, thank you very much, and I have enough of a family right now. Oh, that's stupid question. I won't say you were stupid. Sycamus, go ahead. I'm sorry, Liz, I switched to Sycamus. Go ahead from Sycamus.
Hello.
Yes.
Oh, I love your guest today, Jack.
Where is
intelligent woman or a man you've had on there for years. Anyway, I just wondered if the word is getting around in the United States to the average person, the things she's talking about. We seem to get more information in Canada on what the States does than they do.
I wouldn't say that.
Well, we live down there 6 months of the year, and I have to come home to find out what's going on in the United States.
I think that in general, your coverage of the workplace and workplace news and things like that is much better up here. You have more of a taste of international news than we do. But don't forget, all your standards and all your information, along with the hazards, comes from us.
Yeah, we know that.
Okay, ma'am, go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, Dr. Stellman.
Right.
And Mr. Webster. Dr. Stellman, I have a question for you. I believe there is
type of screen that was introduced. It's similar to the LED screen. It's a liquid crystal. I understand it was developed in Japan.
It isn't perfected yet. This is using little liquid crystals to eliminate some of the radiation. They are not on the market yet, so one can't recommend them.
Right,
it's a difficult, the whole question is really difficult because measuring the radiation is very hard. But, I just really don't want to focus in on radiation. I think we have to focus in on the massive redesign of work that's taken place, the introduction of this automation, the fact that people are losing their skills and are just becoming typists rather than anybody who can use a brain, and that management people are being given these VDTs so they have to do all their own work, so that the whole nature and organization of work has been changing. And I think it's a great problem that we're all focusing in on radiation rather on these much more fundamental problems. What's the difference if your sperm is intact if your mind has disappeared?
Yeah, well, I understand there's jobs that have to be fulfilled.
It's a job that has to be filled, but why do we have to fill it that way?
You surprised me greatly. I thought you were going to come on here with all this VDT caper and this and that specifics. You're saying is that the revolution in technology and computers is going to drive us all crazy.
Oh, I think so. Absolutely. How would you like to eliminate all these people around you and just have a little button that you push that gives you your charts? You wouldn't be talking to anybody. All you'd have is your little machine. You say time, schedule, guest, telephone. Oh, you'd like that, huh? He wouldn't like that. He likes this.
No comment, and that's not for publication. After the break. Fascinating guest, Jeanne Stellman, Dr. Jeanne Stellman. What kind of doctor are you? PhD in something?
Physical chemistry.
Oh, physical chemistry. Where am I going? Go ahead to Jeanne Stellman.
Hello, I'd like to make 2 points. In B.C., in certain hospitals, infant x-rays are done here without holding apparatus or lead aprons, and the nurses are having to hold them, and they're doing it several times a day. And also, 25 years ago, I trained in Scotland. I'm a registered nurse. We had patients with radium implants, and we had lead garbage cans for the linen. We also, every staff member wore radium badges, and these containers were sent off and decontaminated before they went to the laundry. Why can't we learn from places like that?
That's such a good point. First of all, to have people still holding patients, you know what she meant, that the nurses are standing next to the patient while they're being x-rayed, and then they get the scatter x-ray. And the second point about used to have precautions for radium. It used to be about in the 1930s that if a nurse wore her uniform home, she was disciplined for it. Now, a nurse must wear her uniform home because she's given no place to change, no clean laundry. Only the doctors get to get their uniforms, their coats laundered, but the nurses don't. So they're bringing home to their families all the agents and the sickness.
And here 25 years ago in Glasgow, they had lead garbage cans, x-ray shields.
That's right. We have to rediscover
Do we not
things.
have that now?
No.
We have shields, don't we?
I've never seen a patient with an implant with shields, no. And we have nothing. What about the receptionist? I mean, it doesn't end. What about the receptionist who sits in the oncologist's office and all day long has people come in who've been implanted, and she's just continually being irradiated?
But can you avoid that? Is that not a hazard of life?
Oh.
I mean, how could you avoid that?
Well, I think there are probably alternate treatments. I think that we also have to consider carefully the treatments that we do, and that one of the risks, we shouldn't just simply let doctors go off and do anything that they want as potential treatments. We have to realize all the implications, particularly if we don't end up saving cancer patients' lives anyhow. We just did a study on the people who administer the cancer drugs. The cancer drugs themselves are potent cancer-causing agents. And when the nurse mixes up these drugs and she sticks the needle in, there's a whole spray of these agents that goes in the air. And now we've documented that it's spread all over the work table, it's spread all over the uniform, it's spread on their arms.
You're talking about the anti-cancer drugs.
Right, and we found in some of the major institutions that one nurse will give 20,000 doses of this a year. So each individual spray may be nothing, but 20,000 of them over the year. What's her lifetime burden of exposure to agents like this?
Go ahead, please.
Good morning. I have a question for your guest here. I think most women in the workforce who work on video display terminals would be a little more concerned about the effect of radiation on pregnancy than your guest seems to be allowing. She seems to be glossing over the issues, and you talk to any of the unions involved, such as the BC Teachers Federation or the people who work in the airline ticket counters, and they seem to have piles and piles of reports of women who have problems with their pregnancies. And I recently went through a case where my wife was working on a video display terminal and became pregnant and requested that she be transferred and was fired from her job because she was having misconduct on the job.
Okay, pregnancies.
Well, I think that the question of pregnancy and video display terminals is one that must be settled, if only to quell the anxieties. And it's a study that can be done, I would say, if we really went at it, we could do the study in a year. We could just take 5,000 people who work and 5,000 people who don't work and follow their pregnancies over the course of a year, the ones who became pregnant, and we would know an answer. I'm not glossing over the pregnancy problem. I'm trying to set it into perspective. One of the things that's happened to women throughout the Industrial Revolution is that there's always been this great concern about us when we're pregnant, and the hell with the rest. Heck with the rest of the time.
The hell with it.
All right. The rest of the time, women are by and large not pregnant most of their lives, and the issue of the relationship between work and pregnancy is one that demands a broad social outcome. I think that a pregnant woman should not have to sit in a chair typing for 7 hours a day without being able to put her feet up, whether or not there's radiation. I think that the static position, when a woman is pregnant, her blood volume is 140% of normal. It's very hard to sit and type when you're pregnant 7 hours a day. The whole issue of how we care for the pregnant woman, for the planning of pregnancy, and for the father. You know, men are vulnerable to this too. You know, we somehow forget about fathers in all of this.
But are there no statistics which show that sitting in front of a VDT while pregnant cause abnormalities in death?
There are several clusters, and incidentally, I'm very much involved in those. There are several clusters of birth defects which have raised anxiety and which must be followed through. We have to do a scientific study. We have to quell it.
Not properly done yet.
There isn't one study that has been done yet.
Despite all we see in news items, there is not one proper study yet.
That's right. I'm not saying there's no effect. What I'm saying is we have to take 1 year and do the study.
Why don't you do it?
Well, we're just doing a different
Columbia
one.
University.
Well, we do a lot of studies. We haven't done this one yet. We're looking at eye strain and things like that.
Because while I'm out the Yanks, we just sit and wait for you to do your studies, and then we copy your every move where we can.
That's right. When we send you the VDTs, we might as well send you the studies, right?
That's right. We're going to finish up with Jeanne Stellman this morning after the break. From Victoria to Jeanne Stellman.
Yes, Jack. I'm just wondering if I've got a reading machine that's called a Visual Tech. What it does is it magnifies the words from a book, and it's like a TV set with a camera lens built into the side of it, and a few more little gadgets. What I'm wondering is, would that have a really high amount of radiation, or?
No, I don't think it's a camera anyhow. I think that just works by optics. I'm not sure that you have any electronics that. The radiation, if it comes out of these machines, would come from the fact that you're generating a high voltage signal, and I don't believe that that's how yours works. I think yours just works like a transparency overhead projector just to magnify.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Yes. Has the doctor ever had the opportunity to work with asbestos or do research on it?
I make it a point never to work with asbestos, and I myself have not done any work on it. Asbestos is still a problem, and even if we were to stop using asbestos tomorrow, it would remain a problem with us for many, many years because of the millions of miles of pipes and buildings that are covered with asbestos. And it's in the demolition and the rip-out of asbestos that the major exposure actually comes.
That's why I'm calling.
Let me just put it...
planetarium was condemned here in Vancouver. The asbestos removal is supposed to be taking place in the near future. My one point is, I'm
sure that you're familiar with all the research work that has been done on asbestos and how long it took to educate the people that work with it, as well as how long did it take the firms that manufacture it to admit that it is a problem.
Okay, it is a problem. When are they going to tear it out of the planetarium, do you know?
Yes, the tender was let by Vancouver City Hall, I believe, last week.
Okay,
I
hold
know
on.
the contractor who's obtained it. I believe he's from out of the province. I also believe that he does not have qualified trained men.
Okay, hold on. I don't know about that, and I'm not going to judge it.
Well,
Can the asbestos be removed with
safely?
safety?
Yes, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has set up some very good regulations that ensure the trick to handling asbestos is it's got to be wet so it doesn't spread, it's got to be covered with plastic tarps, and it's got to be contained and collected and not put in an open dump where some kids are going to play, as we often do. It's got to be buried back to the earth where it came from. If you follow those rules, you can remove it safely. In schools, in some locations, you'll find that you shouldn't remove it. You should simply enclose it and seal it in. The one hazard of asbestos that I think you ought to also discuss is the question of asbestos in the brake linings. You know, you go down, it's worth a trip to your mechanic's department in your garage just to look at the way they work in there. It's like a microcosm of everything that's bad. And one of the things that they do when they change your brake lining is rather than suck out the asbestos that's there and enclose it in a vacuum bag and get rid of it, it's blown out. And so that the asbestos contamination of the mechanic's garage is humongous, and you can't, it's a very hard to control situation because those are individual people.
No laws on that?
I don't believe you have laws on that, no.
Okay, Jeanne Stellman from Columbia University. Is there any good news? I mean,
yes, I think there's a lot.
The quality of life is not bad.
I think one good news is the fact that we're doing this. You know, 15 years ago, we wouldn't have been doing this. When I wrote my first book, we wrote it because there wasn't a single piece of paper that had any information for workers about health hazards that they could understand. Now we have the BC Fed having a week-long conference with delegates from all over the province, even in the face of terrible unemployment. I think knowledge is power. I think that's good news that we're talking.
My thanks to Jeanne Stellman, Columbia University. Thank you, Jeannie.
Welcome.
Best of luck anyway, and I'll be back after the break.